Michael Jordan walked up to the exclusive club entrance, but before he could step inside, the doorman sneered, "Members only!" The crowd chuckled. He wasn't wearing flashy designer brands, so they assumed he didn't belong. But Jordan didn't argue. He just smiled because he had a plan. What he did next shattered egos, flipped the power dynamic, and left the entire elite world speechless. Stay till the end, because this story will change the way you see power forever. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Sorry, sir, but this club is for high net worth individuals only. The doorman sneered, blocking the entrance. He had no idea who he was talking to. Michael Jordan adjusted the cuff of his black tailored suit, his expression unreadable. The pinnacle loomed behind the doorman, its golden entrance glowing under the city lights. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet arrogance. The playground of the ultra-wealthy, a fortress of exclusivity, where even millionaires barely made the cut. Across the velvet rope, Preston Sinclair leaned against the bar, watching the scene unfold with a smirk. Third-generation billionaire, hedge fund royalty, a man who had never worked a day in his life but acted like he owned the world. Jordan took a step forward, but the doorman blocked him again, this time with more force. "Members only, sir." Jordan's eyes flickered with amusement. He'd been denied entry to places before, back when he was just a kid with a dream. But now, this was new. Preston chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "Look, I get it. Basketball money is nice. But this?" He gestured around the lavish club. "This is a different league." Jordan's expression didn't change. He simply checked his watch, a classic Rolex. Not flashy, but the kind of piece that whispered power rather than screamed it. "So you're saying I don't belong here?" Preston shrugged. "I'm saying you can't afford it. The buy-in's $10 million, not NBA money, real money." The way he said it, like Jordan's billions weren't the right kind of billions, sent a ripple of laughter through his entourage. The doorman, emboldened by Preston's words, squared his shoulders. "If you're not on the list, sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Jordan didn't move. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his presence suddenly heavier, more deliberate. The laughter died down, replaced by a tense silence. A slow smile formed on Jordan's face. His voice was calm, almost amused. "You sure about that?" The laughter spread through the entrance like wildfire, sharp, cutting, and full of arrogance. Preston Sinclair leaned back against the bar, his smirk widening as his entourage chuckled along with him. He had just insulted the wrong man, but he didn't know it yet. Michael Jordan didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable, his stance relaxed. The neon reflections from the club's towering glass windows cast streaks of gold across his face. He could feel the eyes on him, Preston's, the doorman's, the club's elite who had paused their champagne to witness the spectacle. Preston swirled his drink, tilting his head. "Look, I get it. Basketball money is nice. But this?" He gestured around, the luxury of the pinnacle gleaming behind him. "This is a different league." Jordan glanced at his watch, a simple but elegant Rolex, understated, unlike the gaudy timepieces worn by the men around him. He spoke calmly, unbothered. "So you're saying I don't belong here?" Preston chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm saying you can't afford it." The words dripped with condescension. "The buy-in alone is $10 million. Not NBA money, real money." More laughter. The doorman straightened, emboldened by Preston's confidence. His stance shifted, his shoulders squaring as if he had just been given permission to look down on the legend standing before him. "Sorry, sir," he said, voice firmer now, "but unless you can prove your worth." Jordan exhaled slowly, as if considering his options. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling. Preston snorted. "What? You calling for backup?" He took a sip of his whiskey. "Or maybe a loan." Jordan's lips barely moved, but there was the hint of a smirk. He tapped a contact and lifted the phone to his ear. "Let me make a quick call." The crowd, which had been reveling in Preston's mockery, suddenly stilled. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. The air around them grew charged. Preston's smirk wavered for the first time, his eyes narrowing. Who the hell was Jordan calling? Preston laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. "Oh, this is rich," he scoffed, shaking his head. "You really think a phone call is going to change anything?" Michael Jordan didn't answer. He simply lifted the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable. The laughter around him quieted, curiosity creeping in. The Pinnacle's entrance, once buzzing with arrogant murmurs and amused glances, now felt unnervingly still. "Hey," Jordan said casually into the phone. "Tell me something. How much is the Pinnacle worth?" The doorman's smirk faltered. He exchanged a quick, nervous glance with the valet standing a few feet away. Preston's grin stiffened. "Excuse me?" Jordan didn't even acknowledge him. He just listened, his fingers drumming lightly against the side of his phone. A few beats of silence. Then, "Yeah, I'll hold," Jordan said, his smirk returning. "Make me an offer." The weight of his words sank into the space around them like a depth charge. Someone in Preston's entourage let out a low whistle. The doorman, once so smug, suddenly looked like he wished he were anywhere else. Preston scoffed, stepping forward. "You can't just buy a club like this on a whim." His voice had an edge now, the cocky amusement replaced by something sharper. "This place is owned by some of the most powerful people in the city. You think they'd sell to you just because you asked?" Jordan finally turned to face him, his gaze steady. "You sure about that?" Preston's jaw clenched. The call was still ongoing, the faint hum of hold music buzzing through the speaker. Jordan glanced at his watch, then at the doorman, who had gone completely still. "What was it you said earlier?" Jordan mused. "Oh, right. Unless you can prove your worth." The doorman swallowed hard. Preston forced out a chuckle, but it came out shaky. "Please, even if you had the money, they wouldn't." The phone clicked. The hold music stopped. A smooth, authoritative voice filled the space. "Actually, Mr. Jordan, you can." Preston's face drained of color. Jordan said nothing. He just smirked, tilting his phone slightly so everyone could hear. The game had just changed. The real power players had just entered the conversation. Jordan wasn't just here to prove a point. He was here to take everything. The crowd at the entrance fell into an eerie silence, the weight of the offer sinking into the air like a stone dropped into still water. Moments ago, laughter had filled the space. Preston Sinclair and his entourage had been so sure of their place in the world, so certain that Michael Jordan was beneath them. But now the very foundation of their confidence was starting to crack. Michael Jordan remained calm, his posture relaxed, as if the number he had just heard was of no consequence to him. He had played in the biggest arenas in the world, under the brightest lights, with millions watching his every move. A number, even one as staggering as 80 million, was just another challenge to meet. He let the pause stretch, giving everyone a moment to process what had just been said. Preston, however, wasn't ready to accept it. His smirk faltered for the first time, his grip tightening around his whiskey glass as though holding on to it could somehow steady him. His entire life had been lived in spaces like this, places where power was determined not just by wealth, but by who had inherited it, who had been born into it, who had never known anything else. The idea that Jordan, a former athlete, could waltz in and buy his way into this world was absurd. "Did I hear that right?" Preston finally said, forcing out a chuckle that sounded far less confident than before. "You're telling me you're actually considering this?" Jordan didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to fully face Preston, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady and unwavering. He didn't need to raise his voice to command the moment. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of something absolute. "I don't consider," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I decide." The Pinnacle's owner, still on the phone, chuckled lightly, clearly amused by what was unfolding. "Mr. Jordan, we've been looking to sell for a while now," he said, his voice carrying the ease of a man who had already made up his mind. 80 million, and the club is yours." The number hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Some of the onlookers exchanged wide-eyed glances, realizing just how serious this was becoming. Even the doorman, who had stood so proudly in Jordan's way, now seemed to shrink back, his hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. The energy had shifted completely. Preston, however, wasn't ready to back down. His expression twisted in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right argument to stop what was happening. Finally, he let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Wait, hold on," he said, shaking his head as if trying to reset reality itself. "You don't just buy a place like this. It's not some sneaker endorsement deal, Jordan. This is a legacy club. Generational wealth. People like you." Jordan's gaze darkened, his head tilting just slightly. "People like me?" The question cut through the space between them like a blade. Preston hesitated, suddenly aware of the dangerous ground he had stepped onto. His bravado faltered for the briefest moment, but it was enough for everyone to notice. Jordan let the tension hang for a second longer before turning his attention back to the phone in his hand. His voice remained steady, composed, almost uninterested in the chaos around him. 80 million? He repeated, as if turning the number over in his mind. Then, with a light exhale, he gave a single nod. Sounds fair. Preston's face drained of color. His arrogance, once unshakable, now gave way to something bordering on panic. His fingers twitched around his glass as if searching for something to hold on to, some last grasp at control. You wouldn't? Jordan turned his eyes back to him, his expression unwavering, his presence towering. I just did. And with that, the world as Preston knew it began to crumble. Preston's grip on the pinnacle was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Preston suddenly wasn't laughing anymore. Just moments ago, he had been the king of this world, untouchable, revered, the kind of man who dictated who belonged and who didn't. But now, as Michael Jordan stood before him, owning the very ground beneath his feet, the power that had once felt so unshakable was slipping through his fingers like sand. The golden glow of the pinnacle's entrance, once a symbol of his exclusivity, now felt suffocating. He straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to regain composure. Fine, he said, his voice sharper than before, the forced arrogance barely masking the unease creeping in. You bought it. Congratulations. He gave a mocking slow clap, but no one joined in. The crowd that had once fed off his energy now watched in stunned silence, waiting for what came next. But let's be honest, Jordan. Owning the club doesn't mean you belong here. Jordan tilted his head slightly, as if Preston's words amused him. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned, scanning the room. The opulence of the pinnacle was undeniable. Crystal chandeliers casting a soft golden light over velvet-lined booths, an air of exclusivity woven into every inch of the space. But Jordan wasn't looking at the decor. His eyes landed on the people, the ones who truly made this place run. The waiters stood near the bar, their crisp uniforms immaculate, but their expressions wary. The security guards, who had once been so quick to block his entrance, now looked uncertain, shifting uncomfortably in place. The club's general manager, an older man with a neatly pressed suit, stood by the reception desk, his hands clasped together, waiting for what was about to unfold. Jordan took a step forward, his presence commanding. How many of you work for Preston? His voice wasn't raised, but it carried through the space like a statement, not a question. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, almost hesitantly, hands began to rise. The waiters, the bartenders, the security team, the general manager. Preston scoffed, but there was a nervous edge to it. What's your point? He said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Jordan let the silence stretch, making sure everyone felt the weight of what was coming. Then finally he spoke, his tone as steady as ever. Not anymore. The rules of the pinnacle had just changed, and Preston was no longer the one calling the shots. The doorman who had blocked Jordan at the entrance now looked like he wanted to disappear. His once arrogant stance had crumbled, his hands twitching at his sides as if debating whether to fold them behind his back or keep them at his waist. His face, which had been so smug earlier, was now a shade paler, his eyes darting toward Preston, silently pleading for help. But Preston, who had just moments ago commanded the room, stood frozen, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Michael Jordan, however, was as calm as ever. He adjusted the sleeve of his tailored suit and turned to the club's general manager, a man who had been standing stiffly by the bar, watching the entire scene unfold like a bystander at a car crash. Jordan gestured him over with two fingers. What's your policy on... He paused for a beat, letting the tension rise. Let's say firing rude staff? The manager swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. He hesitated, glancing toward Preston, as if waiting for some kind of intervention. But there was none. Well, the manager finally said, his voice careful, technically, as the new owner, you can fire anyone you want. Jordan let his gaze slide toward the doorman, who stiffened under the weight of it. The man's mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to explain, to beg, to undo the mistake he had made at the entrance. But Jordan didn't give him the chance. Good, Jordan said smoothly. Start with him. The doorman's face twisted in horror. Wait! But the general manager didn't hesitate this time. He gave a sharp nod to security, and within seconds, two bouncers, the same ones who had blocked Jordan's entrance earlier, stepped forward and flanked the doorman. Their grips on his arms were firm, but impersonal, as if they were simply removing another piece of furniture that no longer belonged. The doorman struggled for words. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were." Jordan exhaled a small, amused breath. Exactly. The man was dragged toward the exit, his pleas ignored, his struggles useless. The same door he had so confidently guarded against Jordan was now closing behind him, for good. Preston's face was thunderous, his fists clenched at his sides, his carefully curated image of dominance slipping further from his grasp. He had ruled this club for years, dictated who was allowed in, who got to feel important, who got to be humiliated. Now the tables had turned. "You can't just fire people," Preston finally snapped, his voice laced with fury. Jordan gave a slow shrug, completely unfazed. He turned to face Preston fully, meeting his seething glare with nothing but amusement. "You said it yourself, Preston," he said, his voice effortlessly smooth. "This is a different league." Preston wasn't used to losing, but tonight he was about to learn what it felt like to be powerless. A club is nothing without its members, and Michael Jordan was about to fix that. The air inside the pinnacle had changed. The same space that had once buzzed with exclusivity and quiet arrogance now felt tense, uncertain. Preston Sinclair, once untouchable, was watching his kingdom slip through his fingers. His carefully curated world of wealth and status had started to crumble, and he could feel it. Jordan, unfazed, walked toward the sleek, glass-walled office near the back of the club. The staff and guests parted for him instinctively, the power shift unmistakable. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the lavish desk where a leather-bound ledger sat waiting. The club's general manager followed cautiously. "Mr. Jordan, can I help you with something?" Jordan ran a hand over the smooth leather of the book before flipping it open. Inside were the names of every member of the pinnacle, those who had paid their way into exclusivity, those who believed their wealth gave them power over others. He turned the pages slowly, taking his time, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. The crowd that had gathered outside the office watched in silence, waiting. Preston, standing near the doorway, clenched his jaw. Jordan's finger traced down a page before stopping. He tapped the name once and let out a quiet chuckle. "Ah," he murmured. "There you are." Preston leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing. "Wait, what are you doing?" His voice, once so effortlessly confident, now carried an edge of uncertainty. Jordan didn't answer immediately. He let the weight of the moment sink in. Then with a smirk, he pulled out a pen, flipped to the club's official records, and clicked it open. "Kicking you out." Preston had spent his life deciding who belonged. Now, for the first time, he was the one being erased. The billionaire who once ruled the pinnacle was now being escorted out. Preston Sinclair stood frozen, his face drained of color as the reality of what was happening finally sank in. Just minutes ago, he had been untouchable, the king of this exclusive fortress of wealth and power. Now his name, his very presence, was being erased from its foundation. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, tightening in his chest like a vice. The general manager cleared his throat and exchanged a glance with the security team. No one spoke for a second, as if waiting for Preston to argue his way out of this. But there was no argument that could save him now. A tall, broad-shouldered security guard stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave." Preston's head snapped toward him. His nostrils flared, his fists clenched at his sides. "You can't be serious," he barked, his voice carrying more desperation than authority. His eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone to step in, to challenge Jordan, to stop this from happening. But there was no one left to defend him. Jordan, still standing behind the desk, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement, finally moved. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Preston until they were just inches apart. The height difference wasn't much, but Jordan's presence made Preston feel small. "You said this club was for real money, right?" Jordan said, his voice calm, almost conversational. He let the words settle, knowing Preston could hear the quiet power behind them. Then he leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so only Preston could hear. "Turns out, mine's realer than yours." Preston's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The anger in his eyes now mixed with something else, something dangerously close to fear. The security guards didn't wait for him to compose himself. One of them placed a firm hand on Preston's arm, and the other gestured toward the door. "Let's go, sir." "I built this place," Preston snarled, resisting their grip. "This club wouldn't exist without my family's money." "Yet here we are," Jordan said smoothly. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were whispering, eyes locked onto Preston as he fought against the inevitable. Then the first camera flash went off. Then another, and another. Phones were out. The elite guests of the pinnacle, once so loyal to Preston, were now recording his downfall, their faces alight with fascination. The same people who had once hung on his every word were now reveling in his humiliation, eager to be the first to share the footage that was about to take over social media. Preston's chest rose and fell rapidly, his anger boiling over as he tried to yank his arm free. "You'll regret this, Jordan," he spat, his voice shaking. "You don't belong here, you never will." But his words meant nothing now. The guards tightened their grip and dragged him toward the entrance. The doors, once a symbol of his power, now felt like the gateway to his exile. As the doors swung open and Preston was pulled outside, the flashing cameras captured the moment that would soon go viral. Michael Jordan had just rewritten the rules of exclusivity. The world had just witnessed the richest clapback in history. Within minutes of Preston Sinclair being dragged out of the pinnacle, the internet had done what it did best. Turned a moment into a movement. Videos of his meltdown flooded social media, spreading like wildfire. Different angles, slow-motion replays, captions mocking his downfall. All of it had been captured by eager onlookers who knew they were witnessing history. One video in particular gained the most traction. The clip began with Preston's arrogant sneer, his voice dripping with condescension as he mocked Jordan for not having real money. Then came the shift, the stunned expression when Jordan bought the club outright, the desperate protest as security escorted him out, and finally the defining moment. Jordan leaning in, his voice calm but lethal. "Turns out mine's realer than yours." That line became legendary. By the time Preston was shoved into his blacked-out luxury car and driven away, the internet had already decided his fate. Jordan Allen's hit trended worldwide. Edits of the moment flooded TikTok and Instagram, set to dramatic music. Some users turned it into a meme, photoshopping Jordan's face onto a Monopoly board with the caption, "Buy the club, kick out the clown." Others compared it to history's greatest power moves, calling it the billionaire checkmate. News outlets picked up the story within the hour. "Michael Jordan humiliates billionaire" at Exclusive Club ran across headlines. Financial analysts debated how one of the wealthiest men in the city had lost everything in a single night. Not his fortune, but his influence. The story wasn't just about money. It was about power, legacy, and the moment one man's arrogance met an immovable force. Inside the pinnacle, Jordan remained unfazed. He leaned against the bar, watching the chaos unfold on the TV screens as anchors dissected what had just happened. Around him, the same elites who had once bowed to Preston were now gravitating toward him, eager to be in the orbit of the club's new king. A journalist, holding her phone up to record, stepped forward, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eager eyes. "Mr. Jordan," she asked, "what's your first change as owner?" Jordan took a sip of his drink, letting the anticipation build. Then with the same effortless confidence that had just rewritten the rules of exclusivity, he smirked. "You'll see." Whatever was coming next, it was about to change everything. The new pinnacle was about to make history. The atmosphere inside the club had shifted completely. Where once exclusivity had been defined by wealth alone, a new energy now pulsed through the room, one of curiosity, anticipation, and undeniable change. The same elites who had once whispered in hushed tones about who belonged and who didn't now found themselves at the mercy of Michael Jordan's next move. Jordan stood at the center of it all, effortlessly composed, his presence commanding. The glow of the chandeliers cast long shadows across the polished floors as cameras flashed, capturing the moment. The press had arrived in droves, eager to document what the world already knew. This was more than just a change in ownership. This was a seismic shift in power. He turned to the crowd, eyes scanning the faces of the city's wealthiest, most privileged individuals, many of whom had spent years believing they were untouchable. With a slow exhale, he adjusted his cuff and finally spoke. "This club," Jordan said, his voice smooth but firm, "is no longer about net worth." The murmurs started instantly. Whispers of confusion rippled through the crowd as people exchanged nervous glances. A few clutched their expensive cocktails a little tighter, as if the very foundation of their privilege had just been shaken. Jordan let the words settle before continuing. From this moment on, the pinnacle will no longer be a place where wealth alone determines status. He let his gaze linger on a few familiar faces, men like Preston Sinclair's closest allies, who had spent years using their last names as a free pass into power. It will be a place where character matters more than inheritance, where the impact you make on the world matters more than the money in your bank account. A stunned silence fell over the room. Then just as quickly, a new kind of murmur began, one of realization. Some looked intrigued, others panicked. Jordan smiled. The new membership rules will prioritize philanthropists, community leaders, and those who actually contribute something meaningful to society. His smirk widened just slightly. If you've coasted through life on generational wealth alone, you might want to start packing. The shock in the room was palpable. The old guard of the pinnacle, the billionaires who had once dictated who was worthy, now found themselves under a microscope they had never imagined. But outside, just beyond the club's towering glass entrance, stood one man who had taken the announcement harder than anyone. Preston Sinclair watched from the sidewalk, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted with pure, seething rage. He had lost his throne, but Preston wasn't done yet. Preston thought he had one last trick up his sleeve, but he was wrong. Standing outside the pinnacle, seething with rage, he watched as his empire slipped further from his grasp. Through the massive glass doors, he could see the crowd inside, their attention fixed on Michael Jordan, the man who had taken everything from him in a matter of hours. Preston's name, once synonymous with power in this club, was now nothing more than a footnote. But he wasn't finished, not yet. His heart pounded as he yanked out his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he called his financial advisor. The line barely rang before a voice picked up. "Buy it back," Preston ordered, his voice low and sharp. "I don't care what it costs." The advisor hesitated. "Sir, Jordan owns it outright now. We can't—" Preston clenched his jaw. "Then offer him double." "No, triple." A pause. "Triple? Just do it," Preston snapped before ending the call. Straightening his suit, he took a deep breath and stormed back inside. The noise in the club dipped slightly as people noticed his return. They watched with morbid curiosity, waiting to see what he would do next. Jordan, still relaxed, was sipping his drink when Preston approached. Without asking, Preston pulled out a chair and sat across from him. His hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed his desperation. "I'll give you double what you paid," Preston said, his voice forced into calmness. "Right now, wire transfer, no games." Jordan set his glass down, raising an eyebrow as if Preston had just told the world's funniest joke. Preston leaned forward. "Fine. Triple." The club fell dead silent. The weight of that number was impossible to ignore. Even Jordan seemed to consider it for a moment. Then he laughed. A deep, genuine laugh, the kind that made Preston's blood boil. Jordan leaned back in his chair, shaking his head, still grinning. "Not for sale." Preston's face twisted. "You can't be serious." Jordan folded his hands on the table, his expression shifting from amused to deadly serious. "You don't get it, do you?" He gestured around. "This isn't about money. It never was." Preston's breathing grew uneven, his fingers curling into fists. His last play had failed. There was no way back. With nothing left to say, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The eyes of the entire club burned into him as he turned and stormed toward the exit. The doors slammed behind him, but the world wasn't done watching Preston Sinclair fall. Michael Jordan had one final message for the world. As the last echoes of Preston Sinclair's footsteps faded into the night, the pinnacle buzzed with a new kind of energy. People weren't just talking about what had happened. They were living it, capturing every detail, every reaction, every shift in power. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey, but beneath it all, something else lingered. The undeniable realization that a new era had begun. Jordan stood near the bar, unfazed, sipping his drink as if the entire night had been nothing more than a routine game-winning shot. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't seeking applause. He had simply done what he always did: win. A reporter, young and eager, pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand, her phone already streaming live to thousands. She hesitated for just a moment before stepping closer. "Mr. Jordan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. What's the biggest lesson you've taken from all of this? Jordan didn't answer immediately. He set his glass down, swinging in the faces around him, the same people who, hours ago, had either underestimated him or outright dismissed him. Now their eyes held something different: respect, recognition. He exhaled lightly, then smirked. Some people buy their way in, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. He let the words hang in the air, the weight of them sinking in. Then with an effortless shrug, he finished, others just own it. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, not in forced admiration, but in something far more powerful: understanding. Phones shot up, capturing the moment from every angle. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. By morning, it was unstoppable. Jordan owns it trended across every platform. The video, just a few seconds of Jordan's final words, spread faster than any headline, faster than any controversy. Memes, articles, debates, it all centered around the same undeniable truth. Michael Jordan had just redefined what it meant to belong. Within hours, the clip hit 100 million views. And somewhere, far from the pinnacle's golden lights, Preston Sinclair sat alone, watching it unfold, realizing that the game he had once ruled had changed forever. The world had witnessed more than a billionaire's downfall. It had seen a legend rewrite the rules of power.